And I would sort of flip the question around, not say like, what are we trying to do well, but like, what percent of the company's a dumpster fire, right? Like that's what I actually care about. And that's really easy to model.
What if the things that actually drive enterprise value, collaboration, culture, decisions, are completely invisible to the metrics we use to run companies? Ben Waber has spent 15 years proving exactly that. He's a visiting scientist at the MIT Media Lab, the co-founder of Humanize, and the author of the international bestseller, People Analytics. His research has been named a breakthrough idea by the Harvard Business Review, and he's advised organizations from Fortune 500s to the World Economic Forum. Today, Ben talks with us about why most AI productivity claims are dangerously misleading. What does data on millions of workers reveal about the gap between how companies measure performance and what actually drives value? And a story about lunch tables that you won't believe. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's so great to have you. Before we get into the meat of it all, Ben, you grew up in Philly.
Yes.
You studied computer science and Japanese at
I did.
BU.
Correct.
And then you went on to MIT to study salary negotiations. Is that right?
Not exactly. I was fascinated with some of the work going on in Sandy Pentland's group in the Media Lab. And I was sort of interested in social dynamics more broadly. I happened to be, given some initial projects around things like, business plan pitching, salary negotiation, but then started to get more into the workplace. And that sort of, piqued my interest even more.
Well, how did a kid from Philly end up measuring how humans really work? How did this come about?
I started to engage actually in research my sophomore year, and that I did think was interesting. And so then when I decided to go, pursue a PhD, and I saw that his group was doing work on using things like cell phone data to look at interactions between people in society and look how that predicted, outcomes like depression, economic mobility, all those things. And that sounded really interesting. And so, again, I was fortunate enough to get into MIT for grad school. I was really initially working in the laboratory setting, looking at human interaction. And we sort of had developed this sort of next generation sort of sensor badge. But then we had some folks from Sloan, from the business school at MIT say, well, this is interesting, but what if you did this for like a longer period of time in a workplace? Because actually this guy, Peter Glor, who's still at MIT, was looking at this German bank. And he was collecting all of their emails. He was giving them daily surveys, monthly surveys on different aspects of work. And he's like, well, what if you added face-to-face interaction from that with these sort of badges that you developed? And like, that sounded interesting, but we'd never done anything like that before. By the time we landed in Germany, the whole system didn't actually work yet. So it was this crazy process. But, we went into this real organization. We collected data for over a month from basically everyone in this one part of the bank. And this is more data than, there's 4 gigabytes per person per day. This is back in the beginning of 2007. So there's actually a physics problem of how do you get all of that data from Germany to our servers at MIT. It was very challenging. We just ended up shipping hard drives back and forth, basically, because like that was the only way you could do it, right? More data than anyone had ever seen at the time about like how a workplace functioned. And so, at first we're like, let's do the simplest thing we can think of. Let's look at, who talks to who, right? What the structure of that interaction looks like, and then how that relates to, outcomes we care about, like job satisfaction, so the performance ratings, those sort of things. And that was essentially about 2 orders of magnitude, like more predictive of, name and outcome than, any of the other data you looked at, even past performance, right? And so that was interesting. He sent a draft of that paper to actually the leadership of this bank, which is a multi-billion-dollar institution. And they said, wow, this is great. We're actually going to reorganize the whole company, based on this analysis. And,
Wow.
we're a bunch of grad students. We're like, wow, that's crazy.
So you were like 23 or something?
22, 23.
Were you a little like freaked out by your power here?
So I had the naive assumption that, because you have all these like large successful companies that are doing things like they're managing, they're not like falling apart, presumably, right? So like, I always assumed that, when these big companies, like they do a reorg or they build a new headquarters, like they know like basic things about what's going on, right? So we can't be telling them anything like really new, like maybe a little bit.
Oh,
Like,
to be
okay,
22 again.
because we can show them like, oh, how much does marketing talk to sales? And they're like, no, we had no idea. And you're like, well, that is terrifying, right?
Right.
As a 23-year-old to like learn that like, oh my God, like what is happening? We figured then there was a lot more we could do. And so we would go to more and more.
And was marketing talking to sales, by the way?
In that company, they were, but again, it was highly related to actually physical location. This is where it was also interesting with, even the email data. If you look at it, it was highly related to how close people were, physically to each other, right? That basically when people are on different floors, they basically could have been in a different city. It really didn't matter. And these very human things. And we would just sort of replicate that time and time again. And so I got more and more interested in that whole area and what else we could do there. That sort of took off from there.
I love that. I especially love the reflection. There's times where you wish you could have a conversation with your 20-something self. And I have very similar experiences of, wait, this seems so obvious. How is it that you don't know this already? How is it possible that you're running a business? And I would say now that I'm no longer 23, I still have days where I ask myself those questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. There's more and more of those things that have just become more clear over time, I think.
Totally.
So there was another thing from your past that I have to bring up as well, and that was the Japanese double major, right? And so I'm wondering, like, where did that come from, and how has that influenced how you think about culture and everything?
Yeah, there's actually, just to be clear, I did minor in Japanese.
Oh, minor. Okay.
Yeah, but
Okay.
so okay.
I don't want to over credential.
No, I just wanted this, just to make sure the record is straight. But so when I got into BU, you had to be proficient, at least like independent, like at a intermediate level at some foreign language. And I was like, well, I like anime, Japanese. Sounds interesting. Let's do it. Right. As I started to study it, I worked pretty hard at it and I got to be pretty good. And then I decided to study abroad there for a semester. And so then what would happen is I was able to look at Japanese companies to get data from within those companies, and the fact that I could read Japanese, could then interact with different folks, made it, I could do, a lot deeper things. But also, you start to see the differences in, working styles more broadly, and a lot of the assumptions that just we have culturally about when I then started a company. My book did very, very well over there. And just my proudest Japanese moment, which is Meg, I think I've told you before, but I wrote the Japanese intro to my book and they didn't make any edits. And I felt very good about that. And my book did well in the US, but in Japan, it was on the bestseller list for like over half a year. So like I've been recognized on the street one time, right, over there, which I stand out, but I'm going to like hold on to that forever, honestly.
You were recognized.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So I'm occasionally on the news over there when they want, hey, we want some white guy to come on the news, like, and speak about like technology and management. And like, so then I'm on sometimes. And so,
That's amazing.
like how many bald white guys with a red beard and glasses are like, you're starting to get to a pretty, small number. So yeah, that's been entertaining.
So Ben, I'm a runner, and when I run, I listen to music like most normal people do. I understand that you run as well, and maybe a lot, but you don't listen to music. So tell us more about that. All
right. So during the pandemic, I'm fortunate to live right outside Boston. So my town borders Boston. So as a consequence for the pandemic, it was, a great place to be because, you can still get delivery from everywhere, but also like literally a block from my house. And then there's a whole network of trails that goes on for like 20 miles in like any direction. Right. And so, during the pandemic, like that's one of the few activities that one can do like safely. So that's nice. And so, I started to then go for, runs every couple of days just because I found it enjoyable. I tried listening to music at first, stuff like you, but I didn't find it like engaging. And, at the same time, then during the pandemic, all these different academic departments are putting like all the talks are online. Typically when I travel, I actually can run more because then, like if I don't have a meeting for one day, then the kids aren't here. So I don't have kid duty and then I can go run. And so then I'll run, 40 plus miles if I've got time. And, a couple months ago when I was, in Japan, I ran with 58 some miles. Like, so I listened to a lot of different talks. I have, exhausted, now I've also added some, books, but they're always academics. And, it's on topics that are vaguely related. Well, at first it was much more core of what's related to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. But then I really felt like it was important to expand to relevant adjacent areas so that I could better get better perspective on other things that affect how people work effectively and how organizations also function. And so then that starts to touch things like law. And so I actually had my first 2 law review pieces published in the last year. So this very narrow area of law now where I can play a lawyer. And then outside of that, I know nothing. But like I was able to do some of that. And then so obviously a lot more, in computer science and around, AI type work. So I definitely expanded it, and a lot in history as well, because the way that history impacts, the current form of organizations and how work is really thought of is extremely important.
I'm wondering like how your brain works because like so you've got like these very different sorts of and I assume there's lots of different academic talks that you have in one run and so you're learning this new area and this other new area and so on like how is your brain like processing all of the connections and all of that because that's actually why I listen to music is that it allows my brain to like take in all of the stuff that I've learned. So yeah, I'm really
So,
curious about
all
that.
right. So one thing that might help. So I do have ADHD. Being forced to like sit down and like listen to someone talk about something boring is like, I mean, no one likes that, right? But it feels really bad. And so by the nature of the fact that I am physically moving, I have to actually concentrate to understand the content. I do think that, hearing these different disciplines talk about their perspectives on things that, again, are pretty much all somewhat related to work is, I think, helped me, better appreciate the limits of just, using a single disciplinary approach. For a lot of the stuff I'm interested in, it does require pulling at least a couple of these things together sometimes. And now that I know at least enough to be dangerous about some of these things, especially when it comes to things as complex as what we mean when we talk about work, right? And how long the history of whatever we call work is, like how long that history is, how fundamental that is to being human, right? And how that touches all these different things, then at least some grounding in some of these other areas, I would argue is really, really important. I honestly enjoy learning those things. Like that is more entertaining to me than watching Netflix.
Well, I think we know you a little bit now, Ben. So let's get into the big idea. All right. So everyone right now is looking at AI to for value creation. And it's dominating earnings calls, it's dominating board conversations. Meg, you had this great framing of what Ben sees that others don't. Do you want to share a little bit about where you want to go?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think you're uniquely suited to think about and help us talk about is where these inflection points truly are. What investors would think of as value creation. Where are the levers for value, especially against this new emerging idea, which is, oh, well, we're just going to add AI, cut headcount, and magically create a whole bunch of new value for the world, for our business, for whatever. Maybe take us a little bit through the history of what you have learned about how humans create value and maybe what organizations look as signals towards value and humans and work, and maybe some of the things that are a little bit less obvious that your research has brought forward.
And maybe we can bust some myths.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. And bust the myths. I can do that. AI today, they mean generative AI or they mean large language models, typically something like that. Right. Um, and one of the problems, with the way that people are talking about this class of technology, you get, Anthropic, or you get OpenAI, or you get Microsoft, they all have a huge economic incentive to say like, oh, like this thing we're building is it's going to be so smart that it's going to destroy the world. So like you should give us money. Like there's huge incentives for that. And this is further aided by the way a lot of economists talk about the space, where they talk about, oh, we believe that these models can, or have exposed 50% of tasks to, automation, right? Which is really annoying. So just to be clear, economists don't know what they're talking about. The problem, of course, is that for economists and people who like these very simple stories, it doesn't directly automate work that people were doing before. Like new kinds of interaction can happen, and you need to make use of that. You need new workflow. Now, I think part of the allure of the current class of technology is that the only mental model that people have of things that use language fluently are people. Right? And we necessarily, when we then have a technology that can produce fluent text, we assign to that the same characteristics that people have, which, is just like a very, very bad mental model of what these things actually are. And, so I have a piece in HBR, which gets into, a lot more detail about why I think that large language models, as they're currently constructed, are likely to reduce organizational performance over the medium to long term. So for those who aren't familiar, like a calculator used to be literally a person. And actually the vast majority of calculators were women when you get to like the early 20th century, and actually to the mid 20th century. People were like physically running calculations. And so you actually had these like calculation like shops. You could show even in the early 1900s that you had these mechanical, calculation machines that could accurately do a number of calculations, right? And so originally, a lot of the narrative was, great, we've got these machines that can do these calculations. We can just fire everybody, right? And automate stuff. And they just assumed they could do that. Well, it turns out you had to completely re-engineer the process to then feed it into a computer. And then you also had to check it, because these machines you'd have mechanical failures. And so they had to develop all these processes. And all those processes took 20 years to develop. It got to be like 20% cheaper than people. But that is just, to me, like crazy to think about when you're like, all right, literal calculators, like you have calculation machines, and you only got 20% cheaper than having people do that by hand. All right. So, and that's like very clear, right? Where like you've got this technology, like very, very, very clearly does this thing in a vacuum better, like, and more accurately and faster than a person. And even then, it like wasn't that much better, right? Because the problem, this is the whole thing about work, like, and all economists and a lot of people, they want to break down work into these tasks, that's not what work is, right? Work is part of work, right? But work is it's a process. It's a very complex, sort of intersection of different processes, at the individual group, organizational level. And again,
and it includes constraints and coordination and
all these, it includes so many different things. And the problem, of course, is that what organizations use to think of, or how they define things like performance, right? They say, oh, well, performance is completing this task, in this amount of time, right? Which for almost no organization of any size is that actually meaningful, right? And the example I like to use is actually fulfillment centers. A lot of folks, Amazon does this. They, they algorithmically, manage the folks who work in those centers. And they say, if you pack less than a certain number of boxes per hour, we're going to fire you, basically, right? But the logical question, so people could say, well, that's an objective metric, right? But it's not. I almost never use the word objective. It's quantitative. That doesn't mean it's objective. Like there are other ways I could define performance, right? It's a choice, right? And the question, of course, is like, does Amazon actually care how many boxes person A packs per month? But now let's say that person learns to pack a weird product in half the time, and then teaches 20 of their coworkers to do that, right? So Amy, as you were saying, that this is this process between interaction between people. Now, if I'm just looking at that person's individual, box packing output, it's lower, right? Like they would be fired, right? But of course, if they improve the performance of the whole division by like 10%, like, no, you want to do that every time, right? Now, again, you would need someone with the contextual understanding of what is actually going on in that environment to be able to see that, to fully, understand the context even at like a team level, like yes, you do need quantitative metrics, and I do believe in the power of quantitative metrics and algorithms to be used in different situations. But you need this contextual knowledge to really, effectively gauge how effective they are. And that's the thing when it comes to the whole AI discourse, that is just, it's, typically you get, either vendors or even academics who are horribly compromised or have their own very narrow disciplinary view of like, well, I'm an economist and I ran a study where like it output more lines of code, so that's performance. Like, well, listen, a cat having a seizure on my keyboard outputs more lines of code than me. Like, that doesn't mean it's productive, right? No, it's
Right.
not.
Yeah.
It's not a good metric.
So a lot of the productivity measurements and claims and so on, to your point, are misleading.
Yeah, I mean, it could be true. So this is the thing. It's not to say like, again, I think most of them are very not true. The way that people are defining performance, part of the problem, of course, is that this is where people conflate managerial competence with financial performance. And then, of course, the question is, right, if we deploy some of these large language models internally, how do they affect those medium to long-term things, right? And if we can't answer that, right, then we don't really know what we're talking about, right? And if, but that's how we have to evaluate them. Not that like, oh, wow, I can do the LSAT. Whoop de freaking do. I literally don't care. It means basically nothing. People talk about things like they're superhuman at something, right? Which is, I hate that descriptor, right? Because a knife has superhuman cutting ability, but you would never say that. Like, it's true, but like, why would you say that? No, it's a tool, right? So, all right, so high school graduates in the U.S. Get 4-digit addition right 99.3% of the time. Okay, so it's pretty good. Okay, so what if I say I am going to do better than that? I'm going to have superhuman addition performance. I'm going to make a generative AI version of Excel. It does 4-digit addition correctly 99.7% of the time. Okay, that's unusable. That isn't like, imagine that you're using Excel and 0.3% of the cells are randomly. That is unusable. You can't use that. Now, again, does it mean you should have a human like manually calculate every cell? No, it means you should use the appropriate tool, which is a calculator, right? Like, that is correct, right? And so these framings are just so weird. I understand why people are doing them, but like it is very unconvincing to me when people like say these things. You're like, I literally, that doesn't tell me very much at all. Like, it tells me that this is not like the stupidest thing in the world you're working on. It doesn't tell me if it's okay or good, honestly.
And I think it does give a lot of clarity to the context matters, and it matters in how you expect to use it, and it matters also in how you think you want to measure it. And so to the point of, we talk a lot about probabilistic versus deterministic systems, and I think that gets to your point about, accuracy, et cetera. But I think there was another thing that Amy and I have been pondering. We're fans of Nate B. Jones, and he had a really good review of the Klarna situation. The rollback wasn't exclusively about the fact that that they couldn't get the AI to be good. In fact, one of the challenges was that AI was good, but had no nuance in policy. And so because of that, it would do exactly what the playbook said, err on the side of benefiting the company, which could then really destroy customer relationships and shareholder value, right? So there's nuance in all of these things that I think has been built up over the years. And to your point earlier about organizations having no understanding of how it really happens, I think there's a lot of assumptions that have come over time where people believe they understand how things are working, but in reality, it's not as simple as the mental model they might have in their mind, especially if they're, in the stratosphere of executive ranks that haven't done real work in a long time. I think what is missing and useful is to understand better what are the pieces of work that are not just, important for humans to do, but that are maybe more complex than we want to build in these simple context model algorithms that are going to just unleash agents on and have them run through. So what are some of those key things that if we were to try to say, what should we be looking for that are the building blocks of this nuance? What would be some of those things that you've uncovered?
Yeah. No, and so this is, and I will say, I think I actually don't like a lot of the narrative where people are like, wow, these tools are really powerful. We have to force them into our workflow. I advise a number of large financial institutions and technology companies that are under pressure for like investors are, and I think Amy, you brought this up, like on earnings calls, like, oh, are you rolling these things out? One of my clients last week, I said, listen, if you're being asked how many agents you're rolling out, like literally what I would do is I'd spin up a server and just run 100,000 of these things on that server doing nothing. Right? Because that is a meaningless metric. And it could be even corrosive, right? If you're just deploying these into processes that you don't understand at first. And again, so I think there's two things. So understanding deeply the technology, right? And what it actually does. And on a related point, and this is what I would say is more important, right? Which is really frustrating. It's that it gets back to this basic level. If companies don't even know today what drives performance, and they don't even know how they would define performance. Right. So, because typically you stick an executive, you stick the CEO in a seat, if you force them to say, all right, what is the performance of your firm? Typically the first answer that comes out is profitability, right? Or quarterly profit, right? And you're like, okay, well then if it's quarterly profit, then what you should do is sell everything in the company that's not nailed to the floor. You should fire everyone as humanly possible, as many people, and you'll be more profitable. Now, again, you won't exist in the company in 3 months, but you'll be more profitable. And they always say, no, I don't mean that. Okay, what do you mean? Do you mean 5 years or 10 years? Because they're very different things, right? And so you get them to define that. So first you need to define that, right? Like that's something, what do you care about? And it can be a mix. You can say, we're trying to balance things. That's fine. But you need to understand that. And then the question, of course, is what drives those things, right? Because I can tell you what drives those things is not, what percent of employees are spending, 20% of the time on task X. Like that's not, like maybe eventually it gets to that. But there's this next order. All right, what are the things that predict that? And so you have to actually build up this whole model of what actually matters. And then the question is, right, what are the big problems that we have? And then you get to what tools can help us solve this problem, right? And some of this might be, right, using large language. The problem is that most of the time, and the companies that are rolling out these technologies now are that everyone's saying like, wow, all these technology companies are doing so much in the space. Well, again, if you're Microsoft, if you're Google, you could lock your employees in broom closets for a year and it's not going to matter. Like their market position is so dominant. Right? That the fact that they're using some technology, or listen, how would it Meta wasted $70 billion on the metaverse? Like that's impressive, right? That's impressive. Like it's hard to do, right? But so the fact that they're doing something, that doesn't mean it's good.
So Ben, I want to add a third thing that we've talked about on the show. So the first is to understand the technology and what's possible. What are the right tools for the right things? The second is what really matters to the business. And then there's a third kind of in between, which is to understand a domain, right? So in terms of like what's actually useful within a particular kind of set of processes. So you need to know like what's really going to move the needle for the business overall. And then you need to know what the tools can do, but there's kind of a gap between those, and the middle is which is also necessary. So you need all three things. Is like, okay, well, how can we actually leverage these tools to change the process to make what matters to the business?
It's a very good point in that most likely what you're going to find is just plugging these tools into like whether right like what a lot of companies are doing right now, which is that we have all these people who are talking to customers, like Meg, like the example you're talking about, right? And that takes up 50% of the time. We're just let's throw an LM at that and we're done, right? Like it's almost definitely not going to be that. That's almost certainly not. So to your point, the idea of like, you're almost certainly going to have to like do some work, right? Like there's going to be some work. And the other point behind it, and this is what's, really feel like, so, even if you get, and this is just in general about processes, but most companies are also really bad at this. And this is, again, independent of generative AI more broadly, right? Is that most companies, they want you to say, okay, like just tell me what to do, right? Like tell me what thing to implement. This could be a new process. It could be a new technology. Tell me what to do. They implement it. And then you're just like, I'm going to assume that is going to work forever, right? That's the assumption, right? Which is basically always not full. Like the assumption should be it will not work at some point, like in not that long. Even if you're using a model that you fully control, it still is almost certainly going to fail at some point because like the world changes, right? Periodically, let's just gut check ourselves and see like, does that work? But I think it's a very healthy way to just be honest about things. Build something into our process to give ourselves permission to like assume this maybe doesn't actually work like we thought. I think it's interesting.
I like to call that tripwires. And I think that it is important to build tripwires into your assumptions. But in order to do that, you kind of have to be, to your point, intellectually honest that you are using them as assumptions.
It feels bad. Yes.
And the other side of it is, I think you have to have the kind of skill that understands first principles thinking, that has built things up. But what we see in a lot of mature organizations is that those processes were probably built and predate most of the people that execute them. And so not only do they not understand the first principles of where those processes came from, they probably don't understand the things that were true at the point that those decisions were created so that they would have those appropriate tripwires. So I really like your point here that anybody going through this transformation needs to be intellectually honest that we don't understand the durability because things are changing too quickly. And I think the shelf life isn't even just how long will it work, but at some point it ceases to be a competitive advantage. If everybody has a bot that does first line customer support to cover 90% of the tickets, well, great. Now you are just at the new baseline. There's no competitive advantage. There's no cost differentiation. There's no sort of business model durable strength for you. So again, thinking about that we're going to solve this problem and create this new pathway of value is completely the wrong mindset. That's a really important point.
So, Ben, I'm really interested to understand a little bit more in depth about kind of how you look at modeling work and, understanding it, and then, how you capture value. We've been working in HR tech for a really long time, and, HRIS systems were built by us in many cases to track jobs and hierarchies and movement and so on, but they really do not capture how work gets done or what work is happening or anything like that, even if we call ourselves Workday or what have you, right? So there is a growing focus on kind of work intelligence, and the way I see it is that there are tasks and there are processes, there's coordination costs, there are constraints, there's all of these different pieces. And so I'm wondering, like, are those the elements that you see as well? And how do you access that data, and how do you determine what is good and what's bad? Like, I just would love to get inside your brain on this topic.
You're talking about like from, HR systems, that is an incredibly important like piece of the puzzle in my view. I think, if the fact that in the past and even still, like companies don't know like who works for them, like you need to know that. Like if you don't know that, like that's a big problem. So you need to know that, right? And so it is something that matters. But I do think that what's been traditionally neglected is much more of the work data, right? And that's more of, things that now, because of the tools we use just throughout, our day, like the fact that we're using a video conference, the fact that we share, we work on Google Docs together, we send email. Obviously I was working with sensor data as well, and I think that eventually can play a larger piece of the puzzle. But you have all these systems that then tell you about how people are spending time, how they collaborate, and that's sort of how we, back at Humanize, the company I founded with Tammy Kim and Daniel Ogan around this sort of work, got to the point where we're trying to model like basically how people were spending time, and then using that as a lens to look through collaborations. Because then the question, of course, is like, if I email a person, right, how should I count that versus me emailing 1,000 people, right, and CCing 1,000 people, versus me having a 1 hour one-on-one meeting with one person, right, versus having a 1 hour town hall with 500 people. Right. And so the idea was sort of to divide say like divide your attention between those people. So sort of modeling attention, modeling time. And then that gives you a sense of what is the social structure of the organization, how information flows. One of the problems, right, is that, again, if you have a company where marketing talks to sales once a month, it doesn't matter what they talk about. The bigger issue is they barely communicate. And those effects just dominate at large scales, right? Then again, the idea that business outcomes matter as well. Revenue, profit, all those things, right? So you do need those business outcomes. But so again, if you think about it this way, if you've got these, more traditional like HR data, you've got, data on employees, you've got their attrition levels, you have data on your people applying for jobs, so you have your applicant pool, a bunch of stuff like that. You have, and within work, and how people are collaborating, how people are spending their time. I think those are like the big pieces. However, a lot of my more recent work is then around saying, like, okay, let's assume that I have to look at a company from the outside, right? So I can't spend a year with company X to figure out all these things, to interview people, because again, I do think you get really deep context about what you can't get from this other quantitative data around, like, well, why is this team working in a certain way? It can look pretty weird from the outside, but maybe it's good. It could be good. Like, you don't know, right? And that's really hard. Everyone wants to say, like, what predicts high performance? And I think that that's, at this point, too contextual. And so we don't know enough to be able to say what really good is. However, I wouldn't say we've learned nothing. I think what we do know really well is what is awful, right? We're really good at that, actually, right? Like, all right, like, I don't really care what your business is. What percent of your employees work more than 100 hours a week? Right? That's basic, right? It's super basic, but like, we know that's bad. We do know that's bad, right? Now, again, there could be a contextual reason that it's going on, because they will listen, factory caught on fire, we have a deadline, we got to hit. So we know it's a problem, right? But we're going to deal with it. So again, just like if you miss on profitability, right? So if you're a company and you say, listen, I know we missed our profit target this quarter, but we saw a strategic opportunity to acquire company X. Fine, explain it. That's it, right? But then there's other things like that. There's like, are you dangerously siloed? Do you have a dangerous level of weak ties? I think reasonable people could disagree on exactly where you draw the line. But I think if we are very conservative, we say this is definitely something you have to address on an earnings call, right? Then I would sort of flip the question around and not say like, what are we trying to do well? But like, what percent of the company's a dumpster fire? Right? Like, that's what I actually care about. And that's really easy to model. It's also really easy to put dollar values on it, because you can say, all right, like, what percent of your employees are working, again, like spending less than 2% of the time with a manager? Well, like, that's pretty bad. And I can actually model. And there's decades of research on how is that going to impact attrition, and we can cost that out. How much is that going to impact milestone attainment? We can price that out. And so then, all right, this is what's at risk, right? And again, you're going to underestimate it. But again, this is sort of like the dirty secret about corporate valuation.
And so then, in terms of that, so it's easy to model and identify, but what about like getting to the root cause and what to do about it? Do you still need a lot of context, or?
My only point with this is that it doesn't guarantee you it's a problem. It is almost certainly a problem, but this has to be addressed, at the board level, basically. That's the argument. How do you solve that is contextual. And my only point is that from the outside, if I'm looking at a firm, right, and I see those numbers, and I can look at, if you have to tell me, right, what is the financial impact of that? You're required to do that. Or if there's an investor, I won't give you money unless you tell me these things. That's where it's going. And that gets very interesting. Then again, it means you can still solve it however you want. So first of all, the average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO in the US is 2.5 years. But this is the problem with a lot of these things, right? If I invest in, my facilities, if I invest in my people, right? Or I say, I'm going to redesign these processes, right? And this is one of the reasons why AI is so seductive in this way, right? Because it says, all right, like, because it's a sugar rush. You get it immediately. Like, I fired 40% of my employees. Done. Like, I'm more profitable this quarter, which is 100% true. It's true, right? But again, if you flip it and you say, all right, over the near to medium term, like, I'm not looking at what your profit is this quarter, because again, the predictive power of current and past profit on future profit is 1% of the variance. It's basically zero. And so if we think about what stock price is supposed to represent, it is supposed to be your future profits. That's what it's supposed to be, right? And so whenever anyone says, oh, like, wow, like NVIDIA, they just made a ton of money, that means they're worth more. Like, that is insane. That is just empirically wrong, right? And so I'm not saying that people metrics are perfect, but my argument is that they're a lot better than 1% of the variance, right? And so the idea that, all right, like, it's great that you did that. If you don't change any of these other metrics, I literally don't care. That doesn't affect your value at all. And I think that's correct.
Just going back to your point of it's easy to identify what's going wrong, and that's really where to start. And maybe in Meg's and my vocabulary, we'd call that, if the cows are limping, then it's bad.
There we go. Okay, we're getting agricultural analogies in here. I like it. Excellent.
So there's one little story that I want you to share with us. So we heard that you once found that the size of lunch tables predicted programmer productivity more than software tools. Is that real?
Yeah, that is actually real. That is not a ChatGPT hallucination. So for my thesis, I was studying a very large, well-known tech company that does a lot of software. And I was combining a lot of the quantitative data. I was on all their chats, their email data, meetings, performance data. I had, sensor data to look at face-to-face interaction. But also I did, just to be honest, very crappy ethnography at the same time. Like John Van Manen, who's a very famous and much better than me ethnographer, was on my thesis committee, and he was very nice to me. And he didn't say I did a crappy job, but in hindsight, I did a really crappy job. So I was at this company while they were doing this. And so the advantage of that, though, was that I had contextual understanding of what was going on in the data. Because basically what you saw, so there's been a lot of really good work in analyzing software developer team performance. That, so if you look at like code completion, it's like milestone completions. This isn't like bugs and stuff like that. It's like you've got a piece of code, a project you've got to finish. How long does it take you to finish? And some great work by some folks out of CMU, IBM, MIT, showing that if my code depends on your code and you don't communicate, it'll take about 32% longer to complete that code. I noticed something data is weird. It was like, it looked like there were all of these interactions that were happening during, because you would look at when people were interacting. And it looked like a lot of the interactions that were happening between teams were happening during lunch. Right. And that if you interacted with someone at lunch, you were much more likely to interact with them later in the week, which I think is not shocking. Right. It's like, oh, I remember. Yeah. Like you're the person to ask about this particular piece of kit. Like, fine. Right. And again, we don't know exactly what they're talking about each time, but it sort of doesn't matter. You can show that it relates to these completion times anyway. So I feel pretty good about that. But you saw these two different classes, like really different patterns. Right. So you saw like the people had these very characteristically different like lunch group sizes. So some people always had these very small groups. It was like 3 people, right? And then other people had these groups that were 10 people, and it was always 10, right? Sometimes it was 9 and rarely it was 8, but it was almost always 10. And for these 3-person groups, it was almost always 3, and sometimes it was 2, very rarely 1, but it was almost always 3, right? And the people who sat at these bigger tables, right, where, there's more people at the tables, they communicated with them, they were still much more likely to communicate with them later in the week. So I was like looking at the data, I'm like, what the hell is driving this? Because people were always, it was weird because they weren't always sitting with like the same people. Like it'd be one thing if people were always interacting with the same people, right? It changed, but the size of the groups were constant, right? Which is just weird. You're like, what is happening? And then I went to the cafeteria, and as I'm like sitting there eating lunch, I realized what's going on, because there's 2 sets of doors to go into the cafeteria. And basically, once you first start working there, there's a certain way you go to lunch. So you go down a certain stairwell, and you go into the cafeteria. And if you come in one set of doors, all the tables over there are small and have 3 seats. And if you came in the other set of doors, all the tables were big and had 10 seats. And so and there was like, again, if you look at like completion time, you're talking about like a 20% difference in like completion time. It's a big difference, right? And you can pretty convincingly, I think, attribute that to like literally the size of these lunch tables, which is crazy to me, right? That like things like that can have that kind of effect, right?
So which one was better?
The 10-person for this company, and this is the thing, right? For this company, the 10-person was better, but I do think that's highly dependent on the type of work you do. I've just seen this again and again in my work, like how important the physical environment is. And this is still true, even in a virtual world. And, Raj Chowdhury, who's now at LSE, but when he's back at HBS, actually did some work with him back at Humanize, where he looked at our data, and you saw similar things at a very macro level, but from time zones. When people got farther away in time zones, like when you got daylight savings time, people who got farther away were much less likely to communicate. We forget how grounded in like physical reality humans are, and that is so important for how we collaborate, and that to determine how we manage organizations, we can use that a lot more than I think we currently do.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that story.
Yeah, and what a great way to end. We are so grateful for you spending time with us, Ben. It's going to take us a while to process everything that you shared with us, but
I'm gonna have to go on a 40-mile run tomorrow.
There we go. Okay, excellent,
It
excellent.
happen.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, ready?
You betcha.
My team's success depends on another team making proper introductions to our shared customers, but they're territorial and resist doing it. I've tried asking nicely, I've tried escalating, and nothing changes. How do you break through when a peer team is actively gatekeeping access you need to do your job?
It's getting real here, Amy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think this one is so spot on to a lot of what Ben was talking about too, right? In
Yeah.
terms of the importance of how different groups and departments interact and, how that can be red flags, right off the bat. So it sounds like this is a red flag. And a little more context is that this is a sales team and a customer success team that are, that aren't
I've seen this movie. Yeah. So I think I want to answer this across two dimensions. One, putting myself in the shoes of the person that's running one of those teams. I'm imagining that this topic would be a customer success person trying to get connection from a sales team. But also, I think as the one over leader of that as well, because I think there's a systems thing to think about. So in the context of the one over leader, if you're a CEO, if you're head of these groups, I think you really need to look at this as a systems problem, not just a human problem. When people are feeling vulnerable, they tend to pull away. And I think instead of talking to people and telling them to play nice, I think you should take a page out of Patty Azzarello's playbook from Move and think about creating the kind of metrics that force those teams to only be able to succeed if they're working on them together. So really spend the time in the systems problem part and think about where are the ways that you can tie the need for those things to happen to an outcome. So if anybody hasn't read Patty's book Move, the chapter on the limping cows, which Amy referenced earlier in our conversation with Ben, I think is a key point. So that's what should happen at the systems level. But then if you're the individual who's got a team that's being blocked, you may not necessarily control the entire system. I would still argue that you probably can control more at the systems level by having maybe leaning on some of your AI initiatives to have more of the metadata about the account captured, whether you capture that in Salesforce or whatever, so that the contact information can't be withheld. You can find access to it. And then I would go then really deep on the human interaction and try to put yourself in the shoes of the person that's giving you the Heisman. Try to spend some time relationship building, maybe trying to think about or appreciate that person has likely been burned in the past with a well-intentioned person causing harm to the relationship. Maybe putting some energy into figuring out what the needs are of the other person. I'm going to make an assumption the other person is in the sales role. And find out how you can be helpful to them in maybe closing the deal, making sure they're getting what they need from that customer relationship. So instead of just going with the you should be doing and it's my right that you do, spend a little more time trying to understand where is that tension coming from and how can you build a stronger foundation of a relationship such that you have more to give than to take. And I think you'll have a higher success rate if you do.
No, I like it. I'm going to kind of riff on that and probably just repeat it. But I'm gonna say it's riffing. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a misalignment of incentives here. So, Meg put it beautifully that that it's a systems problem and there needs to be alignment. But, for one reason or another, this peer group is not incented to do these introductions, to share the customers, to share the information, et cetera. And why is that? Why are they not incented to do that? And is that something that can be fixed? Perhaps, depending on your role, you could actually fix that systematically or, convince somebody to fix that systematically. A lot of the time, that is not possible for, for all sorts of hair pulling out reasons. At the very least, what you can do then is to understand those incentives, what actually is making your peer group tick, what matters to them, and how can you help with that incentive, right? And so that's kind of back to what Meg is saying, maybe it's really helping to close a deal, helping to, up the usage so that there's, a new opportunity in the works, right? How can that? And then the other side of it is the risks that Meg said as well. So, how can you alleviate the fear of what you could be, doing? Is there some sort of competition? Could you be actually taking away from their upside? Is that there? That needs to be really resolved altogether.
The other thing I was thinking about is that if we're going on stereotypical lines, one thing that we do know for sure is that salespeople are not in love with the paperwork, and usually there's a lot more paperwork at the handover part of the deal between a salesperson and a customer success person. And so maybe if you just changed the process so that you took on some of that lifting of paperwork, that might be a sufficient give that there would be you would be seen as an asset and not a liability, I think. So anything you can do to sort of tip the scale. Yes, it's a hassle. Yes, it's taking on more work. Maybe it's not fair, but again, you don't come to the Meg and Amy show to get what's fair. You come to get what are some strategies that might help you work around it to get what you need done. So that's kind of my thinking on that.
Absolutely. All right, Meg, we are going to wrap up, but what did you learn from our time with Ben?
First off, I knew having Ben on was going to challenge us. I mean, you just can't talk to somebody who's read every single thing and not feel like you're gonna have a lot to take in. And I think people know I have a high tolerance for taking in, so I'm appreciative of just really what that is. But a couple things that Ben said that I really enjoyed. I love his long view about the importance of data and thinking about humans in a more systematic way. I think that's really helpful in how we imagine both the future of work and what does it mean to lead. I think that recognizing that stuff that we know, but it's really important to remind ourselves that little things add up and make a big difference. And when we're thinking about automating and we're thinking about bringing in new tooling, it's really important for us to remind ourselves that we're still experimenting and we should be asking questions about what if it doesn't work, or how would we know when it's no longer going to work? So whatever strategies we're putting in place, whatever systems we're trying to change, I think instead of hoping that we figure it out, the one perfect solution, I think we need to really shift our mindset to what would be a good thing to try. And then back to our Laszlo discussion, how do we use that as an experiment and test it out? How do we build understanding of when those conditions might have changed? And, how do we keep our eye on things that are going to make long-term improvements? So yeah, a lot to think about. What about you, Amy?
I really loved his very simple take on, how do we measure great performance? And his simple answer was, it's really easy to measure what's awful, and let's focus on that. So I thought that was great. I hadn't really thought of it like that, so that was a great perspective. Let's start there. And then the other thing, of course, I asked him the big whopper of the question of, how do you model work and what's important there? And what I learned from him was that, obviously there's tasks and there's process and there's bottlenecks and there's coordination costs and all of these different elements that we said. But the most important thing is really the human interactions, the social network, the fabric, sometimes the physicality, the connectiveness of the people in terms of how well work actually gets done, what the outcomes are, and so on. And this wasn't I hadn't really thought about it quite that deeply before. I had that coordination cost bucket in the landscape, but that is an outsized thing, and it is so important, and that is one of the reasons why I think when we're thinking about AI transformation and we say, oh, it's really about human change management, that is why, because, we can plug in little tools here and there, but the thing that we really need to be focused on is how are the humans coming together to communicate, to work together, to, remove bottlenecks and everything. And can the tools help with that? Or do they detract from that? So anyway, it was brilliant. I loved it.
Yeah, so there's lots to think about, but I think it's super important. So let's invent the future together, everyone. I believe in us.
Let's make every day count.